Hi, today we're going to be going through the TSA 2012 question, could a robot ever think like a human? So we're going to be making a judgment, supporting with reasons, being clear and showing the other side, as always. We're going to be doing this in our standard structure, which is an introduction, 2 points on your side and 1 point against your side, and a short conclusion. In our introduction, we're going to have to define some terms. What terms in this question do you think it's useful to define? So, for me, I'd go with think, because there are many ways in which we could work out what think means. So, you might think that out of the input mechanism output sort of way of thinking about it, we might think that just the output is important. Just having the thoughts is what matters. It doesn't matter how they get there, all that matters is you have thoughts, and if you have thoughts, you're thinking. You might think that input mechanism output, the only thing that matters is everything. We care about everything. So, we care about perceiving experience, and transferring these experiences into thoughts through a mechanism. So we might mind about all of that, and all of that needs to be similar in robots to how it is in humans. Or we might think that the only thing that matters is the mechanism, so they need to come up with their thoughts in the same way. They need to transfer the stimuli, whatever they are, into outputs. Any of these is acceptable, and you can choose whichever works best with your points. Whichever you choose, you'll want to explain why you've chosen it, and why you think it's the best definition. I might also want to define like a human. You might want to think here about emotions. Sometimes humans are irrational. Do you think humans are unpredictable? Do you think we have do you think what we're going to do or think is determined prior to us actually doing it? All of this is worth thinking about in like a human. Finally, just thinking about, you wouldn't need to define this one, but just think about the word ever in the question. Could a robot ever? This removes time as a constraint and therefore removes science as a constraint. You could view it as, is there a possible universe where? So, science is not a constraint, therefore we oughtn't to talk much about the science of the thing. We oughtn't get too much into coding, it seems more of a philosophical question. It seems sensible to ask how best we could answer this question. So how do I answer the question? If you were asked in conversation, could a robot ever think like a human, you'd either say yes, or you would say no. So one of those is going to be our answers today. We're going to want to come up with some points for each. I've come up with some prompts that you might like to use. What are success criteria? So, what would a robot need to do to think like a human? Could we recognise it when it happens? What would we be looking for? Is it even a conceivable idea? Can you think what it would mean for a robot to think like a human? These are all ideas you might want to think about. So, take a minute to think of a couple of points on either side. Pause the video, feel free. So, I came up with a few on either side. So for the yes side, saying they could think like a human, I said a robot. It's conceivable that a robot could pass the Turing test, that is, be indistinguishable from a human, do all the same things. We could let evolution, natural selection do its thing, that's how we got here after all. A robot could think like a human, they could have the same thoughts, but we can't know, so it's hard to answer the question. And we might think that human thoughts is a misnomer, because it makes it seem like human thoughts are in some way different to robot thoughts, and you might not think that's so. On the other side, saying that robots never could think like humans, you might want to say robots could never develop a sense of self, they can never have an identity, emotions are only a thing that are accessible to humans or animals, or that sort of sentient creature. You might want to say the presence of a brain or code for the robot does not imply, that's what that symbol means, it doesn't imply that there's a mind, it doesn't imply that there's any thoughts. You might want to say that computers are predictable where humans aren't necessarily, that humans are able to intuit or infer from experience, whereas robots can only go on rules. And here you might bring in the analogy of the Chinese room, which I don't have time to go over now, but might be worth a quick Google if you fancy. It's really interesting. I'm going to focus on a couple from each side. The Turing test and evolution over this side, and on this side, intuition versus rules and emotions. Let's get into that. So first, in a deep dive into some of the points for yes, they could think like a human. It is possible. I'm going to be using my why so what counterexample structure, so if you want to pause the video and think through these questions before I go through them, feel free. First, we're going to consider that a computer could pass the Turing test. It could act indistinguishably from humans. Why? Well, it could have a really advanced set of rules that perfectly mimic human action, so they act exactly as every human would do. This would mean they're indistinguishable from humans, so we can't tell what's a human and what's a robot. And we assume other humans have thoughts. So, what, you might ask? So what? Who cares? Well, we have no reason to believe that robots don't have thoughts, because they're identical to humans. It doesn't matter that they might be made of metal and wire. You can imagine that they'd be made out of if there was someone who was really good at connecting neurons, they could be made out of the same things as humans were. So they're identical with humans, they act the same and they look the same, and we assume that humans have thoughts. So why wouldn't we assume that something that, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it talks like a human and walks like a human, it probably has thoughts, the idea goes. A counter-argument might be, mimicking action, or acting in the same way, does not imply that they have the same way of sort of mechanising experience, of experiencing things. So just because they act in the same way does not imply they have a mind. A second point would be that we could let evolution work. That's how we got here after all. So why? Humans have a set of rules. These rules come from evolution, you might argue. So we do act according to a set of rules, and that's how we think and why we have thoughts. Therefore, the distinction from robots might be a weak one. So there may be no reason to say, over here are humans, over here are robots, they're different because. We might say that we're on the same scale, but the robots are slightly further down it, or something like that. So humans do have a set of rules, and robots are pretty much the same thing, just happen to be made of metal. So they could mimic the rules by allowing natural selection. So if we create some biological robots, and then allow natural selection, you might imagine that in the same way that thoughts develop for humans, thoughts develop for robots. You might ask, so what? Well, saying human thoughts, as if they're different, might be meaningless. It might be meaningless to say human thoughts, because robots might have human thoughts, so we may as well just call them thoughts. So think like a human might just mean act according to rules that come from evolution. So humans can already be viewed as complex biological robots, so robots can think like humans. Can you think of a counterexample to this? Well, you could argue humans aren't just a complex set of rules. Consider moments of genius, bits that no one had ever even thought about before and seem to have come from nowhere. The theory of special relativity, maybe, or Beethoven's Fifth. These come from nowhere, they're moments of genius, they don't appear to come from a set of rules. You might also say humans are unpredictable and do things we don't expect them to. Therefore, the set of rules argument might fall down, you decide. Let's look at the other side. This side says it's impossible for robots to ever think like humans. So, first point is humans have intuition and computers can only rely on rules. Why do we think this is so? Well, humans can make subtle inferences from experience. They can look back at their life and say, this tends to happen, let's do that. But even more subtly than that, computers rely on rigid rules, and therefore they think in different ways. Might ask, so what? Well, if two things work differently, one works with rules, other works more subtly with subtle inferences, if two things work differently, they're not alike. So we can't say that robots can think like humans. Can you think of a counter-argument? Well, again, we might say experience shapes these inferential rules. If we previously think that maybe when I throw bread into a duck pond, all the ducks come over, that might be experience, and it shapes an inferential rule from experience. But it is a rule. When I throw bread into a duck pond, the ducks come over. Computers can mimic this development. You can imagine a computer realising that when it throws bread into a duck pond, the ducks come over, and noting that as an inferential rule. So maybe this is not such a strong point. A final point would be emotions are purely human. Let's look at why with an example. Spend a minute thinking about regret, and whether you think computers can have it. So, regret means, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I hadn't said or thought that. Now, this is problematic for computers, or for robots, because of two words in it, I and wish. You might want to think about what they mean. When a robot says I, do they have any concept of self? What does I refer to? Also, what does wish mean? Is it with reference to their goal? That would seem one idea, but their rules are meant to get to their goals, and at the time they acted because they had to, according to the rules that they were set. So the computer acted at the time in the right way to get to its goal, as far as it knew, so it oughtn't regret it. It may, now that it, let's say, regrets, but it doesn't actually regret, it may change the rules, but it's meaningless to say that it regrets something, because it may not have a sense of self, and it may not have past referential desires. It may not wish about the past. You might ask, so what? Well, if humans can regret, and robots can't, the two do not think alike. A counterexample to this might be, well, it's invalid to assume there are problems with I and wish. A computer or a robot may have a sense of self, and may have past referential desires, because these things may come out of rules from, say, natural selection. There are strong points on both sides. Whichever way you're arguing, argue as strongly as you can. I hope that's been helpful.